Hi, everybody. This video is going to go over your focus questions and your annotations. Make sure you complete these before attempting your writing prompt. My recommendation again is you watch this live time, and live time also you can pause and make your annotations as this is playing. What's good about it is that you can go at your own speed. You can watch it and pause it, as many times as you need. So with that, to start off, we will put our computer into split screen mode. That way we can see our focus questions on the left-hand side, and we can see our reading on the right-hand side. We have our annotation button open, and we'll also have numbers open. That way we can refer to paragraphs quicker. So with that, we have 4 focus questions today. Let's see the first one. How does Mr. White approach the game of chess that he plays with his son, Herbert? What does this reveal about his personality? And how will he react when he learns about the monkey's paw later in the story? As always, support your answer with text evidence. So I'm looking for a personality trait that I can learn about Mr. White, specifically from their game of chess. And also, knowing he has this personality trait, what could I assume will happen when he learns about the paw? So with that, I'm going to want to review paragraph 1. I recall this is where the chess game starts. Without, the night was cold and wet, but in the small parlor of Laburnum Villa, the blinds were drawn and the fire burned brightly. Father and son were at chess, the former, who possessed ideas about the game involving radical changes, putting his king into such sharp and unnecessary perils that it even provoked comment from the white-haired old lady knitting placidly by the fire. So I see the chess game right here, father and son, they're playing chess. The former, so looking at the first person, which is the father, what do I learn about him? He possesses ideas about the game, which involved radical, crazy, unorthodox changes. He puts his king into sharp and unnecessary perils or danger. Even so, it stands out so much that it provokes comment from his wife, Mrs. White. We can learn later on. So, what I learn about him, and because I have annotations already on, make sure that's the case, I can click on and I'm going to drag it all the way to perils. The color we choose doesn't really matter. We'll use yellow. Mr. White seems to be reckless or a risk taker based on the way he plays chess. And with that, I will press create note. As always, as a point of reference, if you need to go back and edit, you'll just click on your annotation and you will press edit. When you do that, you can change the color, you can add, and whatever you put, make sure you press save note in the end. If you just press X, it won't save what you typed or what you changed around. So let me get into my explanation of this. Mr. White seems to be reckless or a risk taker based on the way he plays chess. If you've seen people play chess, if you know anything about the game of chess, the whole goal is to keep your king safe and to take the other person's king. In this case, Mr. White, he risks his king. He puts his king into danger. And that's why I think he is a reckless person or possibly just a risk taker. That is what I learned about his personality. Now, knowing he's reckless, knowing he takes risks, let's see what happens. Does his risk pay off? Even provoked comment from the white-haired old lady knitting placidly by the fire. Hark at the wind, said Mr. White, who, having seen a fatal mistake after it was too late, was amiably desirous of preventing his son from seeing it. He made a fatal mistake playing, so he's put his king in a fatal position. And notice it is too late. He's going to lose his king. He's going to lose the game. Mr. White's risk does not pay off, and in fact creates a fatal mistake. Fatal, a synonym for it, is death. So if something is fatal, it's going to lead to death. In this case, fatal will lead him to losing the game. Mr. White's risk does not pay off and in fact creates a fatal mistake. Let's see if it gets played out. Does Herbert see it? I'm listening, said the latter. So that's going to be the son, Herbert, grimly surveying the board as he stretched out his hand. Check. And notice, yes. Let's create that final note. Mr. White loses the game because of his, we'll say deadly to mix it up. No, we'll keep it fatal. Fatal / deadly. There we go. Mistake. This shows me that he does not make the best decisions. So knowing he's a risk taker and it doesn't always play out for him, what's going to happen to him later on if he makes a risk? And actually right here, the mate part, so checkmate, that's where he loses. If you want to highlight it too, we'll just do that. Check and then finally make checkmate is what's said when you lose a game. Mr. White loses the game. And create notes. Perfect. So that's what we see in those opening 5 paragraphs. The second part of our question, how is he going to react when he learns about the monkey's paw later in the story? With that, I want to go to paragraph 39, and I want to say we'll read through 44 if I recall. This is where the paw gets introduced to him. He took the paw and, dangling it between his forefinger and thumb, suddenly threw it upon the fire. White, with a slight cry, stooped down and snatched it off. So this he is not Herbert. This he is not Mr. White. This he is Sergeant Major Morris. He takes the paw, throws it on the fire. So the paw is in the fireplace. It is burning. Mr. White stoops down and snatches it off. Mr. White puts his hand into the fire. Definitely sounds risky. Continues the idea we saw in paragraph 1. I'm going to highlight this entire sentence. I'll keep it with yellow since we're still talking about 1. Mr. White shows that he is reckless / risk. I'll say risky because he snatches the paw out of the fire. Create note with that. Better let it burn, said the soldier solemnly, so giving him a warning, hey, let this thing get destroyed or be destroyed. If you don't want it, Morris, said the other, give it to me. I won't, said his friend doggedly. I threw it on the fire. If you keep it, don't blame me for what happens. Pitch it on the fire again like a sensible man. Telling him clearly, hey, don't blame me if you use it. I'm trying to destroy it. I'm telling you, don't keep it. What does he do? The other shook his head and examined his new possession closely. How do you do it? He inquired. Hold it up in your right hand and wish aloud, said the sergeant major, but I warn you of the consequences. So even knowing there's consequences, even knowing his friend wants him to destroy it, he says, no, teach me how to do it. Teach me how to use it. Definitely solidifies this idea of being a risk taker. Even knowing there's consequences, bad things will happen, he's going to take that risk. Mr. White will take the risk of wishing on the paw, even knowing that there are consequences and that his friend tried to destroy it. So what we have, Mr. White will take the risk of wishing on the paw, even knowing that there are consequences and that his friend tried to destroy it. So he could not use it. And we'll say create note. I think the ordering would have been better to mention first that he tried to destroy it because of the consequences, but either way, what you guys write, should not be word for word as me, just explaining my thought process through this. So I think we've clearly looked at this, what happens in the beginning of the story and later on. Personality trait, Mr. White, he is this reckless or risky person. With that, let's move on to number 2. How does Mrs. White's attitude, as well as her circumstances, create a problem for both her and Mr. White at the end of the story? How does the setting add to the suspense? And as always, use that text evidence. So we're looking at 2 things. We're looking at Mrs. White's Mrs. White's attitude. How does her attitude create a problem for her and her husband? And also, how does the setting develop to create suspense? With that, I want to scroll back to 1. I skipped over it on purpose because I knew we'd come to this question. The first time we ever see Mrs. White, we know she is a white-haired old lady who is knitting placidly by the fire. Placidly is a big word for us. It's how she is knitting. She is very calm. She is undisturbed. She is a peaceful person. We'll switch it to blue, so we'll do all blue for number 2. Mrs. White is described as a placid or calm person. And this definitely changes in part 2 after the death of her son. So we'll say create note here, and then we'll go and we'll check out 119 all the way through 128. So scrolling past part 1, scrolling past part 2, I'm sorry, I go a little bit ahead of myself, and now we're into part 3 of the story. So 119, the old man turned and regarded her, and his voice shook. He has been dead 10 days, and besides I would not tell you else, but I could only recognize him by his clothing. If he was too terrible for you to see then, how now? Bring him back, cried the old woman, and dragged him toward the door. Do you think I fear the child I have nursed? So already in this part of the story, Mrs. White has come up with the idea, hey, let's use our second wish to bring back Herbert from the dead. Notice how she's responding, cried, and drags her husband towards the door, almost forcing him. Let's highlight all of 120, and we're using the color blue. Mrs. White is dragging and forcing her husband to get the paw to make the second wish. Let's see if this gets developed. He went down into the darkness. Okay, so setting-wise, I know it's dark. And felt his way to the parlor, and then to the mantelpiece. The talisman was in its place, and a horrible fear that the unspoken wish might bring his mutilated, destroyed, disfigured son before him ere he could escape from the room, seized upon him, and he caught his breath as he found that he had lost the direction of the door. His brow cold with sweat, he felt his way round the table and groped along the wall until he found himself in the small passage with the unwholesome thing in his hand. Even his wife's face seemed changed as he entered the room. It was white and expectant, and to his fear seemed to have an unnatural look upon it. He was afraid of her. So very clearly, when we bring the paw back into the room, Mrs. White seems to be a different person. If I remember back from paragraph 1, she is placid, she's calm, and now she's expectant with an unnatural look upon her face. Wish, she cried in a strong voice. It is foolish and wicked, he faltered. Wish, repeated his wife. Notice even at this, the dialogue in 123 to 24, I see exclamations when she's saying wish. She is speaking in a strong voice. In comparison, how is Mr. White speaking? He falters. So his speech is kind of broken up. He's nervous. He does not want to make this wish. He raised his hand. I wish my son alive again. Talisman fell to the floor. He regards it fearfully. Then he sank, trembling, into a chair as the old woman with burning eyes walked to the window and raised the blind. So here again, I see Mrs. Wife, and I'll take all of it, actually, 122 through the end. Mrs. White. Mrs. White's face has an expectant and unnatural look upon it before Mr. White makes the second wish. I see wish twice. And I actually want to keep that strong voice part into it too. You know what? And I will take all of 123 to 125 because we're looking at the comparison of the dialogue. What is the contrast with both of our characters? Mrs. White is demanding her husband to wish. Mr. White does not want to make the wish. And we saw his reasoning earlier. He does not want to see his mutilated, disfigured son. In the end of the section, he sinks trembling into the chair, so he's shaking. But the old woman has burning eyes, eyes of desire. She walks to the window and raises the blind, looking for her son. After the wish is made, Mr. White trembles in fear. While Mrs. White expectantly waits for the return of her son. The last part we have to look about is how does the setting create suspense? A little bit earlier, I know he was feeling around in darkness, so right, spooky, right? So he went down in the darkness. We'll keep this in blue. Just because it's all for number 2. The setting is the house at night in complete darkness. Creates for a spooky atmosphere, right? Let's see how this gets developed in 128, our last paragraph right here. He sat until he was chilled with cold, glancing occasionally at the figure of the old woman peering through the window. The candle end, so there's a candle in their bedroom, which had burned below the rim of the china candlestick, so it's almost out, was throwing pulsating shadows on the ceiling and walls. So spooky. The candle's flickering, it's almost out. There's these shadows appearing on the ceiling and the wall until with a flicker larger than the rest, it expired. The old man, with an unspeakable sense of relief at the failure of the talisman, crept back to his bed, and a minute or two afterward, the old woman came silently and apathetically behind him. So Mr. White feels a little relieved. He thinks the wish did not occur, but then we know what happened later on. Oh, there's a 2-mile separation between the graveyard and the house. So, zombie mutilated Herbert. It's going to take him some time to get there. He was crushed by a machine. We don't know if he's crawling, if his legs work, what happened. But either way, this last spooky, suspenseful part, I want to take it from the candle end to when the candle goes out. The candle ominously goes out, or you can say flickers out, whichever, when the second wish is made. The house, once again, is in total darkness. This creates a suspenseful atmosphere. And that wraps us up for number 2. So Mrs. White's attitude, because she demands for the wish, and she gets her demand, she gets her wish, that ends up, leading to Herbert coming back from the dead. How is the setting suspenseful? We're in complete darkness when we make this wish. And really, to cap it off, our candle flickers, 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 throws up these scary, spooky shadows, and then it dies out. With that, let's move on to number 3. What causes the downfall of the White family, and how is it related to the theme, or a possible theme, of the monkey's paw? So with that, what causes the downfall? Clearly, using the paw is what destroys this happy family. With that, I want to go back to paragraph 26 to begin. 26 is back in part 1, and we're looking at what causes the downfall of the White family. In 26 is where we hear what happened to the paw. It had a spell put on it by an old fakir, said the sergeant major, a very holy man. He wanted to show that fate ruled people's lives, and that those who interfered with it did so to their sorrow. He put a spell on it so that 3 separate men could each have 3 wishes from it. So in this dialogue, and I will highlight all of 26. Let's see, color-wise, we already used yellow, we used blue, let's use green. In this piece of dialogue, we hear about the curse. And I know they say it's a spell, but in the end, we really learn, hey, it's negative, right? So a negative spell, we'd say a curse. If it was a positive spell, we might call it like an enchantment. Think of like a Disney movie, but in this case, clearly a cursed object. So in this piece of dialogue, we hear about the curse that was placed on the paw. The curse would teach people that if you messed with fate, then that would lead to sorrow. Again, clearly hearing from the start, we don't want anything to do with this paw. Let's go and check out 54 through 53. I'm sorry, 54 through 57. What else do we learn? Where do we see this downfall actually occur? We've heard about the paw. Clearly, we've been told not to use it. What happens? Mr. White took the paw from his pocket and eyed it dubiously, doubtfully. I don't know what to wish for, and that's a fact, he said slowly. It seems to me I've got all I want. Clearly, Mr. White says, I don't really need to make any wishes. I've got a good life. If you only cleared the house, you'd be quite happy, wouldn't you? Said Herbert, with his hand on his shoulder. Well, wish for 200 pounds then. That'll just do it. So Herbert says, hey, Dad, wish to pay off the house. His father, smiling shamefacedly at his own credulity, he's saying, man, I can't believe I'm actually going to do this, held up the talisman as his son, with a solemn face, somewhat marred by a wink at his mother, so even the son doesn't believe in it, sat down at the piano and struck a few impressive chords. I wish for 200 pounds, said the old man distinctly. I'm going to see, I've never tried to do like this many paragraphs. I want to do 54 through 57. In green, I'm going to say, Mr. White says he does not need to wish because he has everything he wants. He still wishes anyways, which might show he is greedy. So because we make that wish, even knowing we've got all we've ever wanted, my character showing that he is greed or he has also a greedy nature. Remember, he's a risk taker, he's reckless. Even hearing about all of these horrors that it does, he still makes a wish. And notice, did he even need to make a wish? No. I've got everything I want. He can't even believe that he's actually making the wish, and yet he still does. So maybe there's also a lesson about greed in this story. Should you or should you not be a greedy person? With that, I want to continue this idea of the downfall of the family. Let's check out 105 through 113. So now we're scrolling into part 2 of the story. She came stumbling across the room toward him. I want it, she said quietly. You've not destroyed it. It's in the parlor, on the bracket, he replied, marveling. Why? She cried and laughed together and bending over kissed his cheek. I only just thought of it, she said hysterically. Why didn't I think of it before? Why didn't you think of it? Think of what? He questioned. The other 2 wishes, she replied rapidly. We've only had one. Was that not enough? He demanded fiercely. So it sounds like he's learned his lesson. Hey, we shouldn't use this. No, she cried triumphantly. We'll have one more. Go down and get it quickly and wish our boy alive again. That's crazy. Using a wish to try to bring somebody back from the dead. Definitely something that's unrealistic. People don't come back from the dead. What is she trying to be? The man sat up in bed and flung the bedclothes from his quaking limbs. He's shaking just hearing this request. Good God, you are mad, he cried aghast. Get it, she panted. Get it quickly and wish, oh, my boy, my boy. Her husband struck a match and lit the candle. Get back to bed, he said unsteadily. You don't know what you're saying. We had the first wish granted, said the old woman feverishly. Why not the second? A coincidence, stammered the old man. Go and get it and wish, cried his wife, quivering with excitement. And this is where more of the horror starts to get into the story. And we saw more of this back in number 2, like how does this play out? But notice the second wish comes totally from Mrs. White. If I scroll back a little bit, I want to see where she actually again says, let's wish for him to come back. Yes, 112. Mrs. White comes up with the idea to wish her son back to life, which is an unrealistic request / wish. Sergeant Major Morris, again, back at the start of the story, tells us if you must wish, make sure you wish for something sensible. And that's in the case where Mrs. White jokingly says, give me an extra set of hands. Mr. White's about to wish until the soldier, forces him, pulls his hand down and says again, if you must wish, wish for something sensible. Do not wish for something unrealistic. With that, we'll press create note. And the last part I want to read is 143 through 144. Just how does this story end? But her husband was on his hands and knees, groping wildly on the floor in search of the paw. So already Herbert's knocking on the door. Mrs. White is trying to let him in. If he could only find it before the thing outside got in, a perfect fusillade of knocks reverberated through the house, and he heard the scraping of a chair as his wife put it down in the passage against the door. He heard the creaking of the bolt as it came slowly back, and at the same moment he found the monkey's paw and frantically breathed his third and last wish. We don't hear what the wish was, which builds the suspense. What could it be? The knocking ceased suddenly, although the echoes of it were still in the house. He heard the chair drawn back and the door opened. A cold wind rushed up the staircase, and a long, loud wail of disappointment and misery from his wife gave him courage to run down to her side and then to the gate beyond. He's checking. I don't see any Herbert. The street lamp flickering opposite shone a quiet and deserted road. He wishes his son back to the grave, or to undo his second wish. Let's take a final note right here. Mr. White wishes to undo his second wish, which sends Herbert back to the grave. Effectively, Mr. White loses his son twice. Because of his first wish, his son had to die, and now with his third wish, his son kind of dies again. A horrible thing for a parent to experience. So what we have again, Mr. White wishes to undo his second wish, which sends Herbert back to the grave. Effectively, Mr. White loses his son twice. We really see the downfall of the White family because of making these unchecked wishes that really show greed. Greed, one, wishing for money that you don't need. And then you can say greed, two, wishing for a life, something you cannot or should not be wishing for. Something that's really out of your control, which again, the curse of the paw was meant to show that if you mess with fate, you're going to do so to your sorrow. And with that, guys, let's look at our last focus question. We'll focus on 3 more paragraphs, and we're going to look at setting. The entire story is set in the Whites' home, yet it seems different in each of the 3 parts of the story. Why are these changes significant? How do they contribute to the theme of the story? Highlight evidence to support your ideas, and write annotations to explain your choices. So we're looking at setting and how setting changes to develop the theme. With that, my first one, I want to go back to paragraph 1, and I want to focus only on the setting. Without, the night was cold and wet, but in the small parlor of Laburnum Villa, the blinds were drawn and the fire burned brightly. So notice we've got a contrast here between outside and inside of the house. Let's see, a color we have not used. Let's go with purple. The setting is nighttime, and there is a storm outside of the house. Inside the house has a warm and cozy fire burning with a family sitting around it. Sounds like a nice, peaceful time inside of the house, while outside seems a little dangerous. You wouldn't want to be outside in the middle of a storm. So notice, how does it start off setting-wise? Everything looks great inside of our house. Outside, dangerous, unsettling, right? The setting is nighttime and there's a storm outside of the house. Inside the house has a warm and cozy fire burning with a family sitting around it. There is a contrast between the outside and inside of the house. With that, I'll press create note. So again, our happy family looks undisturbed. And then once we let that outside in, Major Morris comes in with the paw. That's when we bring that danger inside of the house. We make a wish on it, and then, our family falls apart. Father becomes very fearful. Mother becomes very demanding, almost crazy. And we know the son, Herbert, loses his life. With that, let's check out paragraph 67. If I recall, that's the first paragraph of part 2. Part 1, we make the wish. And in part 2, the wish is fulfilled. We lose Herbert. But let's specifically look at setting. Part 2 opens up in the brightness of the wintry sun next morning. As it streamed over the breakfast table, he laughed at his fears. Who's laughing? And again, it is Herbert who is laughing. If you recall here, paragraph 66 is where in previous lessons we really analyzed how the setting changes at the end of part 1. That warm, cozy fire begins to die out. Herbert's sitting by himself. Everyone has abandoned him. And what's the last thing he sees in the fire? He sees a horrible and simian, monkey-like face looking at him. He gets uncomfortable, takes a cup of water, and throws it over the fire to kind of extinguish the face. In 67, so again, that fearful scene, right? How the fire changed. In 67, notice the next day, it's a bright and lovely morning. The air was prosaic and it had wholesomeness about the room, which it had lacked the previous night. And the dirty, shriveled little paw was pitched on the sideboard with a carelessness which betokened no great belief in its virtues. Clearly, it's a bright, happy morning. Nobody's worried about the paw, but they should be, with the one reason why. Part 2 is where Herbert ends up dying. We were using purple. After using the paw, the house becomes dark and we'll say spooky. When part 2 begins, the house seems warm and wholesome. The family does not know about the evil that will occur. Again, another example of contrast. When we should be worried, we are not. The setting is nice and bright, even though this is like the darkest part of the story. And our last paragraph, let's go focus in on 128. Is there any final change here? What happens to our setting? I think we already marked up 128. Yeah, and 128, when we make that second wish, our house is in complete darkness. So really, there's a contrast between light and airy inside setting that becomes darker and darker and darker as wishes are made, really foreshadowing that evil is going to occur. Notice in part 1, the fire goes out, and that's when the evil occurs in part 2. In part 3, the setting starts to change. It gets darker and darker at night. Candle finally goes out, and then we see the evil that kind of ramps up at the end. With that, we've done all our focus questions, our annotations. We're going to move on now to our writing prompts. I am not going to be doing any writing with you. To get here, you got to close down split screen mode. I just want to review your prompts. The prompts for your test For this reading, we covered theme, which is the lesson of the story, and analyze how story elements, specifically setting, interact to develop the theme. In a constructed response of 6 to 8 sentences, you're going to have to identify a central theme of the monkey's paw and analyze the way events, so the plot, setting, where is it located, and character interactions, really that should be underlined as well, help develop this theme. Make sure to use race when writing your response. Some hints to help you along your way. What is the main conflict? Mr. Whiteface's. How does the change in setting create a mood? And what was shown through foreshadowing? Lastly, what does Mr. White learn? What I recommend you do when you write, you press split screen. That way you can see again your focus annotations, and hopefully they can guide you along with your response. I also recommend you using your think questions and the skill questions, the skill focus questions we reviewed to help you with this. If you come up with any technical difficulties, send me an email, or if we're meeting live, feel free and just turn on your mic and ask me. Um, with that, guys, good luck, and I wish you well on your quiz, on your test. I'm sorry.